This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and today is Sunday, June the 24th, 2018. This is the last Sunday of June, because there are only 30 days this month. And this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at conservation, rails, trails, greenways. And hey, we've got our first echinacea in our front yard. It's finally, little purple blooms have come out. We haven't seen them yet this year.
Purple cornflower.
Mm-hmm.
So today is a memorial to Robin Mittenthal. It will be at the Quaker Church at Main Street at 3 o'clock. And Robin was a local person. His parents were academic people and very big guy. And he did a lot locally and joined community activities and an environmentalist. At the University of Wisconsin, he was an advisor to global health for probably 6 years before he was coordinator for Upper Midwest Center for Excellence for vector-borne disease. Vector-borne disease is associated with creatures that carry on the work of insects often have life histories where they are involved in various life cycles, and that is so it's not only insects that are the sort of secondary hosts of a disease, but the study of it is often referred to as zoonosis. It brings some logical thought to how mosquitoes carry things, how ticks and will carry viruses, and have a life history where you can sort out what the intermediary hosts are and perhaps control the disease that way. Plants have the same problem with rust. Rust is a disease that can diversify very easily, but it has a host in barberry bushes, and that is where you can hit the control of barberry bushes and reduce the rust risk. So he was studying entomology because entomology is insects transmit a lot of diseases. So he was doing a PhD at the same time as he was doing a lot of other coordinatory things. He coordinated community gardens, about 500 of same. He was a father, farmer, husband, and we will remember his activities. A tree fell on him while he was working on his farm. And so I want to emphasize today, we're repeating some things, but in mid-June, the prairie, a lot of the prairie plants come to their peak. And we've run through in the last couple of weeks with Bill Saylor, and we've looked at the Second Street. But what I want to remind you is that many of those plants are coming to their head right now. And so I went around yesterday and photographed some of those plants that are in bloom. It's not always easy for people to realize what those species are, but I have an evil intent of perhaps having a blog where you can get access to that detention pond on 2nd Street. The city has, to give it real credit, has put in a lot of native plants. There are three sort of ponds in a way, and they can retain water and prevent flooding on campus town. The water is retained in what is referred to as a big dig, and then slowly allowed out to the boneyard in a sensible fashion, so there's not a lot of flooding. The boneyard comes in from the north. It is a small stream when you're in the daytime and there's not much rain. But when there's 5 inches of rain, as we've been getting fairly heavy storms, then you get quite a lot of flow. The boneyard doesn't always flow in a meander, which what water does. It meanders left and right, and it meanders up and down. So you have riffles and little areas of impoundment behind a riffle or a small waterfall. But it's been restored in a manner that allows to be open space on either side of the stream, which is kind of sensible. Sometimes people build right up to the stream, and that's no longer a useful paradigm. You start a little north and follow the boneyard under the Park Street. You can see where the Park Street has been concreted. It's a brick street, and there's concrete where the creek runs under it, and then it goes through and gets to be urbanized some before it runs under University Avenue. You don't realize it's running under University Avenue, but that's what it does. There's a little, a very nice little area just south of University Avenue, and it has been planted to a number of reasonably popular prairie plants, and they're doing quite well. It'll take years for it to settle down or to fill in, but the grasses are growing well, and there's this little detention area. It's not really holding back water, but it takes in water from the runoff from the hill, and the impoundment will come when there's some rain that runs in there, but it can also be very dry in summer when the boneyard runs underneath it, not on top of it. The drop seed is a very nice and diplomatic prairie plant. It's there in profusion, and probably about 20 or so species. There's a cardinal plant, which usually needs to have its feet in water, but it's just coming up to bloom at the moment. There's purple coneflower, and there's orange milkweed or butterfly weed, and there's prairie clover, and in the damper places there's a flag lily, and just for you to go to that spot. You get to it by going just a little bit east of the Habitat for Humanity building, and then you more or less drive in on what used to be 2nd Street, and there's excellent parking there, and a lot of people come in and park and run the trails that are in the detention pond. The boneyard runs under, and there are seats and places where people can enjoy it. You can look down the boneyard and see some native species, but you can also see some non-natives. There's a bunch of mustard plants there that belong to the crucifera family, the cross, 4 petals. So it's cruciferous, belongs to the cabbage family, and is not as native as some. They're further as you walk down towards the larger detention pond. This is not really a pond. This is an area that takes water when it has to, but the creek runs alongside, so it's not a favorite place for ducks and geese. But they do come there, but not as permanently as in the second pond, which is deeper and wider and more appropriate for wildlife that needs to land and take off and investigate the food that's under the water and walk around the lawns that where they can find vegetation and other creatures that they eat. Not always appreciated, but we'll get to that a little later. Let's see some of the species that we're passing. There's a bank of yellow coneflowers, and they're quite appropriate. They hang over the walkway, and you can encounter them. You have to be respectful of the pollinators that are there. If you encounter Italian bees, just respect them. If they get into your hair, don't whack them, because that releases a whole bunch of enzymes and hormones and things that attract other bees. Just carefully take your hand and move the creature out of your hair or out of the place where you find them. So just to be able to walk with vegetation somewhat hanging over your trail is kind of interesting, and we encourage that. In Chicago, they encourage that too, so that people get to be right where there is a place for people to back their houses up to a trail, and so that the trail becomes a little overgrown, but a little rambunctious, but rather interesting. So it takes 5-10 years for that to happen. I found a verbena growing, and we walked past our pocket prairie that has been relocated to this part of the Big Dig. It's growing well. It's a little damper than we anticipated, but that's because we've had a lot more rain than anticipated. There are hills and dales that people can enjoy. There are mown areas. So I would encourage you to go look for some of these plants in their native state. The city is probably about 5 years ago planted grasses. There's switchgrass, there's a little blue stem, there's big blue stem, Indian grass. I don't see cordgrass yet, but that could be there too. And there's always a little confusion about cordgrass because it tends to stop the flow of water, and in this case, or most drainage cases, people are wanting to get rid of water quickly. But if you're an environmentalist, you're probably more likely to want that water to absorb slowly into the underground aquifer. And so we don't have cordgrass at the moment. But on the heights there are pollinator plots. They were planted last week. They looked a little sickly to start with, but they're perking up and growing well. And there will be today, I think David has some information about a pollinator event at the Children's Museum.
Yes, this is not a free event, and full disclosure, I actually work at the Children's Museum. So for the last week, we've had pollinator-related events at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Today is the finale, and Dave has graciously agreed to come on over, and he will actually participate and tell the kids at the museum at 2 o'clock this afternoon some things about the prairie plants that we have, and maybe even non-prairie plants, where the emphasis, of course, has been on the insects themselves that do the pollinating. And again, this is not a free event. You'd have to pay and have kids with you to come to the Orpheum Museum. And again, I work there, so this is not yes, I'm just going to stop talking about it now.
Yeah, it's a fun museum, and children get to do things and parents get to supervise that too. And some of them come to other events in town, like on Friday at night when there's music. There are people with ballooning, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but they blow bubbles, and some of the bubbles are very big, and it relates to the science behind what you can do. So you can encounter those sorts of bubbles at the museum, but then they find their way into the music genre too. So now we're still working around the more shallow pond to the north, and now we go over White Street and into the big pond, and there again native plants have been installed, and there are some that are more prone to be in disturbed areas. There's a daisy fleabane that just gives a white blush at the moment, and that's there because there's disturbance. Sometimes the disturbance is because of the creatures that are there, and you get herons and other wildlife other than the ducks and geese that seem to haunt the place. I sat there the other night and watched a little of the family relationships that were there, the mother and the father and the children, and there were 3 geese that were together, and one, I'm not even sure it was a goose, but it's absolutely white, but it seems to associate itself with 2 other rather differently feathered friends, and just to see that sort of interrelationship was rather good. There were regular milkweeds, and there are waterfalls that are created so that you aerate the site, and so eventually that water moves to the south end and is pumped up very near where there's a little historic railroad museum that used to be an interurban, and then that water flows into Scott Park. Again, the water runs under Springfield Avenue, and comes out in Scott Park, so named after a previous mayor. And that area, there is a meanderer, and there's a sort of a rain garden, so that you have to realize that if the water comes through a plant, it is going to reduce the runoff and creates absorption. It sort of deals with some of the material that might come in from urban settings and purifies the stream. And once again, this is not a pond, this is a stream, so you don't get quite so many geese and ducks. And nice little areas where you can get an idea of what is native. There's culpus root, there's one area where towards the north entrance where culpus root, it has a nice little candelabra of white, and it's fruiting at the moment. So I would encourage you to park on what was 2nd Street and go visit the detention pond. It's not going to be the world's most biodiverse prairie, but the little pocket prairie that we've relocated there will help to give it some biodiversity. The rocks that are around are mainly sedimentary rocks, not the glacial rocks that we would have locally, but we don't have very many local rocks. They drop out in Canada and other places, so they get to be expensive, and the sedimentary rocks are cheaper and interesting, and you can sit on them. They're in stairwells and whatnot, and it's fun for young children to find this site and enjoy it. After last week, Ron Sleater called me up from Decatur, and we decided immediately to go to Rantoul, to the Pope Prairie, because I'd been there the day before, or couple of days before, and had reported that on the program last week. But we needed to spot herbicide teasel, and I'd observed certainly that the teasel was growing 6 and 8 feet tall, and it was about to produce fruiting bodies. Those fruiting bodies in the past were used to tease wool so that you could spin it and weave it. And this pod, when dry, is very prickly and is good for teasing wool. These days we have a more professional teaser that do it differently, but that was what the settlers used. It is also a very popular dried arrangement and gets into the cemeteries, and Pope Prairie is very near a cemetery in that area. So we've been spot herbiciding. We spot herbicide because this plant has a ring of leaves that cover up the prairie plants and deny them. And if you cut the fruiting body off, it immediately, and more or less seemingly to enjoy that, and put out more fruiting bodies. So it's almost impossible to not spot herbicide, despite people's reservation about using herbicides. We use Roundup, sometimes something stronger if we're getting to the point of having a difficulty. There have been no off-road vehicles activities lately, but we do find crawdad holes in a little stream that comes through, and those crawdad holes often become little burrows for snakes, and we've had some interaction with the Natural History Survey people who would like to study those crawdad holes. They put down a 3 foot by 3 foot piece of plywood that attracts the snakes, because also that board sometimes attracts meadow voles and mice and creatures that the snakes can utilize. So there will be some research on that piece of preservation. You have to know that it was a gravel pit, so it's regrowth succession from the interurban and the main line nearby, and so we are careful to keep the teasel out of those areas. We don't get as much teasel on areas that have been established for a long time, because teasel likes to grow, is an agronomic cultivated plant, and it's going to grow better where the soil is soft. And most of our railroad right-of-way prairies have been there for 100 years, and they've been rained upon and they're walked upon, and they're fairly hard in terms of soil. So prairie can handle hard soils. It's grown up with the hard soils. So where there is the interurban and where the ballast remains, the interurban supports native species, and we have to use those native species to give us the imagination of what we're trying to replicate in the borrow pit across the way. The borrow pit took out about 8 feet of soil. It was not really soil, it was glacial till, mainly gravel, and an excellent road pack for widening roads. It's often referred to technically as a borrow pit, but the material is taken, but it is never brought back. It's just that's what used to happen when you had a road and you had to put in a bridge, so you sent the road around. You could take that gravel back, but that seldom happens these days. Oversighting is a long-time thing. I think we've been doing it probably for 6 years, and we've controlled the teasel problem. I was taking photographs because if we had to have people to help with those areas, we need them to know what the weeds are. And the teasel is not the only one. Another invasive tree, a very invasive tree, is autumn olive. And so that is there. And it's in amongst the cottonwoods, which do belong. Cottonwoods grew on the prairie. They were probably one of the only trees on the open prairie. Champaign County was 94% prairie. But you would have cottonwoods growing in creeks. They have very deep roots, and they can get into the aquifer. So we have some rather big 2-foot diameter cottonwoods, but in amongst them are these Russian olives, and a number of somewhat aggressive native trees. There are cherries, there's hackberries, and a lot of trees that don't really belong there. So we're part restoration prairie people, restoring a borrow pit, but we're also gardens in a way. We're taking an area that was once in agriculture and returning it to nature, and that means we have to seed it with seed from the adjacent interurbans and try to do it in a way that is in keeping with what would have been there at settlement time. It's a little bit too bad that there's so little remnant prairie left that we sometimes do not have a good bead for figuring out what was. And there's always a dynamic. We'll change it over the years, but we do the best we can, and it's important that you know about those places. So I'd encourage you to go to Rantoul. The Pope Prairie is about a mile north of Rantoul. The road, the current 45, goes out and around the cemetery. The old road to the south, the old 45, used to be a narrow road that went behind the cemetery, and our access to our prairie is in a triangle that belongs in that general area. So where the one road goes around the cemetery, the old road goes behind the cemetery, and we have 9 acres there of reasonably nice restoration prairie, and at least some of it is remnant prairie, because not all of the borrow pit was harvested for gravel or till. The species there are probably slightly different from the regular Drummer and Flanagan soils that have been taken over for agriculture, because the moraine or the glacial material that melted, the continental glaciation that melted at that location, left a ridge and of till, and that till is gravelly, and it warms up earlier in the spring. It's a continental glaciation that came down from the north, so it's an east-west corridor, and it warms up from the south. So it's probably a little bit earlier than most, so the plants there may be a little advanced of what you might get in Champagne, although Champagne also has its temperature dimensions. The urban air conditioners and the open spaces and concrete mean that the temperature in downtown Champaign is probably about 3 degrees higher than it is out in the farmland. So you have to think about these things and get more subtle in your looking at the plants. For instance, if you're looking at some of the plants that we talk about for pollinators, we're looking at plants that are cultivated plants, and we have to make sure that they don't get into our prairie plots. One of them that is a very good pollinator is sweet clover. It's a white sweet clover and a yellow sweet clover. And those plants can be very invasive. They were brought here because people who wanted to have their cattle calve early in the spring realized that the prairie is only just coming to its head now. If you go look at the Big Dig, you'll find that the clump grasses are growing very well right now, but you know that if you were to drop calves in the spring, there was not much vegetation. So sweet clover and white clover could be harvested by mowing 8 times a year. And actually the cutting of the plant encourages growth of subsidiary shoots, and it was a very useful plant. If we get it in our prairie, then it denies other creatures that are not quite so aggressive. So we try to keep the pollinator areas different from the prairie areas. So once again, Rantoul is valuable because it it is on a moraine, and part of it is wet because that's where the glacier would melt and melt the water out to places like Flatville. But it also goes up the hill and has a dry aspect to it. When the glaciers retreated as the earth warmed, then the meltways like the Illinois River and the Mississippi River dried up, and that powdery material, still very fertile, was blown across the country. So you have loess on top, and that often expresses itself on top of the moraine. And so the species are different. And it's kind of fun to walk that corridor. That corridor goes from Rantoul to Paxton, 10 miles, and we'd like to figure that this area that we have, 9 acres, could be a starting point for a prairie trail. We'd like to keep it narrow. Between us and the cemetery, there is a plot that would be very nice to develop as an extended prairie, where we could put trails through it and feel a little more free to do educational work. So this week I asked what the price might be on the purchase of that corridor. That little 10 acres, it would be in the vicinity of $50,000, which is not that big a deal if you're trying to preserve the last 0.01% of remnant prairie and to teach and to create a corridor that actually supports a lot of intermittent prairie plants, and with a little tender, loving care, that could be a place where there's original soil and the ability of prairie plants to survive. You'd also have to get rid of the teasel. You have to think about the problem of maintenance. Just buying a site or working with the Department of Transportation to recreate a trail parallel to the modern Route 45, that takes money and energy and people who are committed to that sort of thing. Not easy. There's always the argument that you can develop what you have better and not bother about buying more, but then when you're down to very much near to nothing, it pays to buy that little pieces that you might be able to utilize for educational purposes. And what we do is largely oriented to education, and we're not a major organization, but we've spun off other organizations, and they do educational work, and we're still working at that. And for those of you who understand, I'd like you to go to Rantoul. It's about 18 miles from Champaign. Just go up Route 45, and a mile north you'll bend around the cemetery and go to the first section road. It's 3200 north, and there's roadblocks on the old road now. The Department of Transportation has done that. We have to have a dolly to roll in there, but it's you're able to park on that same road that goes north. It's not controlled as we control, or as the Department of Transportation has controlled the Pope Prairie area. The Pope Prairie has its name because as you moved out around that cemetery, you created an opportunity for headlights on visual corridors to hit upon billboards. And the Pope family ran the Champaign-Urbana outdoor advertising company, and it has now been sold to Adams, but it was an advantageous place when 45 was the only highway to Champaign. When 57 was put in, it replaced that. So you're looking at a tradition that was the Pope family, so that's the Pope family Prairie. And the family knows we use that name, and they were pleased to do that. And when the opportunity came, we had for years been preserving that site, and the Clayton Pope, who owns the territory, realized what we were doing, and we obtained this and bought that site with his knowledge, and he's visited to see what we do with that site. And it is a simple but rather interesting prairie restoration. It's well deserving of your attendance. At the moment, the purple coneflower is there. It's interesting that sometimes the whole site is alive with purple coneflower. This year, it's not expressing itself in that way. The same happens with other plants like compass plant and dock, and there's seasons when it's very prominent, and it depends a lot on climate and the specific details that you might like as a student of nature to know and to observe and to figure out what creates the response of plants and animals over the years. Just documenting things is important. So as Ron Sleater was herbiciding, I was putting in, I had a 100-foot tape, and I was putting notes on the road so that you could come to a point and know where your crawdad hole was, or where a certain plant that is a hybrid was. It gives you a chance to be a little bit more research-oriented. On the east side of the bulge around the cemetery, there was going to be a dual highway, but that was negated by the institution of Route 57. But ash trees were planted there, and unfortunately the emerald ash borer has eliminated those trees. They're dying at the moment, but surprisingly, underneath, the prairie is starting to grow. Wow.
9 more minutes.
I was going to say something about Australia. We've been talking about Australia. The ABC, Australian Broadcasting Commission, did a backroads thing of that went through the little town where I grew up. It's just wonderful to go back and look at some of those sorts of things. I would like to encourage you folk to do that with your families, to make a record, to preserve a document that we will pass on to your friends and relatives. Might not be read for 20 years. It may, on the other hand, be developed quickly and be helpful. So don't be afraid to start. Just start with something like, what did it feel like to walk with bare feet in a bull dust? You might think that you're not an expert, but there's somebody who will never have the opportunity to walk in bull dust, and your comment may be really nice. Sometimes if you draw, you might draw the school where you went to school, or the playground where you were, or the roots of a tree, and you'd be surprised that even if you don't think you can draw, you might be able to draw more than you can think. So I'm encouraging you to do things like that. The same sort of programming looked at the Murray River in Australia. You have to know, talk about plate tectonics, moves the continent of Australia, Gondwana land, up. And so you have this waterfall way, which we were looking at last week, with waterfalls on the east side where the water, where the continent has been moved up and the water is moving to the Pacific. And then that plains, the slopes behind are gentle, and the rivers there run to the Australian Bight, and that's like 1,500 miles or more. And that was an area that got drier as you went out. And we talked a little bit about having dust storms because people would go into a 10-inch rainfall area and it wasn't enough. And then if they had 6 years of drought, you would have it even more rough and more isolated. But the paddle wheelers, in the days when there were no trains and there were no trucks, the paddle wheelers came up that river, and in drought it would be hard to move along that river. So gradually they put in locks so that would back up the water. We do it with the Mississippi. We've got 29 or 30 locks along the Mississippi so that a paddle wheeler, which doesn't pull a big draft, could move along that river all the way up the slope from Adelaide to Riutpur to Albury. And it was surprising how far you could get up. And you could get, when you had a rainy season, you could move the paddle wheeler up using those locks. When you have a lock, you have small towns, you have people who have irrigation. And so there's always the argument about how much you can irrigate, how much water you can take out of the river, so that the people on the Adelaide end don't end up with no water or salty water. But the transportation is there, and the docks are there. There has been a move. When you want to cross the river and you have a dam, then you have ferries. So ferries are rather small. Sometimes they're wound across the river on a hawser by hand, sometimes with a motor, and they carry 6 or 8 cars and horse and a few other things, and the government decided that these were superfluous, but these are small communities, and you get the atmosphere of using and utilizing those little ferries to get across the river, which is swollen because of the dams and the locks that are there. So think about the east side of Australia, where the fast water flows to the east and the slow water flows to the west more gently and irrigates on the way. There are irrigation areas that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this water. So looking at the time?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So think about that in relation to other countries, and think how, if you understand that and then understand the sociology about it, the tourism that might happen, where you might have a history where you can tell people something. You might just put up a big shoe and say, this is where Mother Hubbard used to be, and it's interesting and intriguing, and it's something that brings people together. But we need people who will tell stories and will have artifacts that enable a story to be told, and that's part of what the little pocket prairie was. It allowed people to happen upon a prairie that was not necessarily a very diverse prairie, but enough to allow people to understand their heritage ecosystem. And it might not be a biological heritage. It might be like the Spurlock Museum. You might have a history of Ivesdale and Irish and what was Catholicism. You might have a relationship to modern events like Plato. So Spurlock Museum deals with the concept of putting a educational device where people could interact with a computer, and that again is history. But it takes someone to record that sort of information. And okay. So part of what we do with this program is an attempt to get you to think about the landscape you're in. Go to Allerton Park, go to Shady Rest, go to the Clinton Power Plant Lake, and think about the landscape that's there. It's not just flat. It's a 6-inch rise may give you an opportunity to dream about what was in that low spot, or what might be along the railroad line and what might be brought in by the railroad line. A mullein, for instance, has come in. Knapweed is something that seems to be a railroad right-of-way weed. Dame's Rocket is a cabbage plant, and so I think we have to go. It's Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.